Thank you so much, Tadej. Welcome everybody to the NLI USA Signature Speaker Series. I'm Adina Canefield, the CEO of NLI USA. This series, as many of you know, is designed to further the library and to make it a center for lively discourse as inspired by the library's collections and by contemporary issues facing all of us today. And certainly during this time right before the high holidays, this time of reflection, many of us are thinking about relationships. And with that, I am absolutely delighted to bring to you Rabbi Wolpe, Kinney Zalesne, and Dr. Stefan Litt, who will discuss relationships in the digital age as inspired by Martin Buber. I bring you Rabbi David Wolpe, who is the Max Webb Senior Rabbi of Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. He's the author of 8 books, including the national bestseller, Making Loss Matter, Creating Meaning in Difficult Times. Rabbi Wolpe has been named the most influential rabbi in America by Newsweek and twice named among the 50 most influential Angelinos by LA Magazine. He's taught at a number of universities and written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the Jerusalem Post, among many other outlets. His most recent book, David, the Divided Heart, a biography of King David, was optioned for a movie by Warner Brothers. Next year, Rabbi will be a visiting scholar at Harvard Divinity School. Kinney Zalesne is an American writer, strategist, and former business executive at Microsoft. She was the CEO of a firm specializing in CEO positioning, communication strategy, and thought leadership development. Kinney was counsel to US Attorney General Janet Reno and a White House fellow with Vice President Al Gore. Kinney is also the co-author of the best-selling book, Microtrends, The Small Forces Behind Tomorrow's Big Changes, and the regular Wall Street Journal column of the same name. In the theme of relationships, I want to note that the special relationship exists. There is a special relationship that exists between at least 2 of our speakers here today, Rabbi Wolpe and Kinney Zalesne, who grew up in the same synagogue outside of Philadelphia. Rabbi Wolpe's father officiated Kinney and her husband Scott's wedding, and Kinney's mother, Judy Zalesny, who is on this Zoom, was Rabbi Wolpe's 11th grade English teacher. In true Buberian spirit, they are going to have a dialogue about the state of relationships. But before we hear from them, I am honored to bring you Dr. Stefan Litt, who will share highlights from the library's Martin Buber collection. Dr. Litt is the curator of the Humanities collection and an archival expert at the National Library of Israel, where he is in charge of European language holdings. He received his PhD in pre-modern Jewish history from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Dr. Litt has published on the history of early modern European Jewry and on modern Jewish archival collections. As you are preparing to hear from our speakers, which is happening right now, I invite you to pose questions as they're speaking in the chat, and those questions will be addressed at the end of the talk by our amazing speakers. And now I bring you Dr. Litt.
Thank you so much, Adina, and welcome to everyone also from my side, from Jerusalem. And I'm inviting you to join me into one of the most important and most prominent archival collections that we host in our archival departments. We have there a bit more than 1,200 archival collections of very different sizes and contexts, of course. But Martin Buber's archive is definitely one of the most important and most popular. So I would like to invite you to follow me on this presentation. I think you should be able to see that now. It's about, this gentleman who is a very famous one, and you see him on different stages of his life. And actually the fact that he very consciously kept so many items and different parts of his life and things that can tell stories of his life also revealed something about his personality. So even this childhood picture, and it's not the only one that we have in this collection. So Martin Buber was born in Vienna in the late 19th century, if you wish so. And sorry, I'm jumping all the time. Sorry for that. And he grew up with his grandparents. His grandfather was Solomon Buber, who was also a Jewish scholar in the field of Jewish tradition and Jewish history. Martin Buber grew up in, which was then Lemberg. Today it's Lviv. It's located in the Ukraine. He did not grow up in the German language, but in Polish and Yiddish, and later on learned German and many other languages. He was fluent in, I think, 6 or 7 different languages, and was also able to write texts in those languages, which is not so special in this period, actually, especially not in Eastern Europe. Multilingualism was very, very common in those days. He was a student in different towns and cities in Europe, in Vienna, Leipzig, and other places, and very early became acquainted with the leading Zionist figures of his time, among them Theodor Herzl, of course. Later on, he was the editor of different journals and Zionist newspapers. The most famous one was his own creation called Der Jude, the Jew, which was a cultural Zionist, very high-level intellectual journal. Between 1924 and 1933, he taught at the University of Frankfurt in the field of Jewish religion, but of course was dismissed immediately in 1933 when the Nazis came to power in Germany. He immigrated to Israel in 1938 and became professor at the Hebrew University, professor not for philosophy, as you might think, and as he definitely hoped, but for anthropology and sociology. And he taught there until 1951 and was one of the most important intellectuals in Israel, definitely, and one of the most debated intellectuals on the other side also because of his sometimes not very popular ideas about the role of the Jewish people in the land of Israel and other issues. So when he, shortly before he died in 1965, he decided to bequest the National Library with his archival collection. And for that purpose, he came in person to the then new building, which is still our current building, in 1960, and checked the premises if they would be fitting for the needs of his huge and rich collection. I will say some words about it in a minute. And he met with those 2 distinguished gentlemen. On the left-hand side, it is Felix Welch, who was a philosopher by himself. He grew up in Prague and was a professional librarian. He was a senior librarian in our institution as well. He was a good friend of Franz Kafka, by the way. And on the right-hand side, that was Kurt Wormann, who was head of the library then, who came from Berlin originally. So we may assume that these 3 gentlemen talked to each other in fluent German, which was their mother tongue. So what can be found in the Martin Buber archive? As I said, it's one of the largest personal archives in our collections. We measure archival materials in shelf meters. It comprises 52 shelf meters, and I think it takes the 3rd rank when it comes to quantities. So what's included there? You have rich biographic material about Buber, all kinds of documents, photographs, of course, which I just showed you before. And maybe the main bulk is about 45,000 letters he received by others and wrote to others. You can see just one example here on the right screen side, which is a handwritten letter by Buber on stationery of this famous journal, Der Jude. So currently there's a project run by Frankfurt University in Germany in order to create a complete online edition of Martin Buber's correspondence based on our collection. We have, of course, almost all of the manuscripts that he wrote during his lifetime, and manuscript was in the meaning of the word, in the best meaning of the word for Martin Buber, to write it by hand. He was not a big fan of typewriters. He usually wrote his manuscripts by hand in his most beautiful handwriting, and I will also show you one example in a minute. Photographs I mentioned already, and he kept hundreds of those. And also, most important, manuscripts he received from others, because he was such an authority and such a valued reader by others that many of those felt very sure to send Martin Buber their text in order to receive his reactions and comments. Some of the items that I love most, and others too, for instance, this early photograph, which is from 1899. It shows a group of Jewish students in Leipzig University. And before you are trying to guess who Martin Buber might be on this picture, that's the young gentleman right in the center of the picture with the hat and the white gloves, holding a sword in his hand. These are usually all the characteristics of German student fraternities, which were copied by Jewish fraternities as well. So Martin Buber was active in that, and as we know, he also developed many of his early Zionist ideas in those Jewish university circles. Another very, very important issue in his creations and during his lifetime over many decades was actually the German translation of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible, which he started jointly with the famous philosopher Franz Rosenzweig, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years later. But Buber continued their common project over the decades and just finished it here in Israel in the early 1960s, creating a very special and very much following a translation that very much followed the original intentions of the Hebrew language. And you see how intensively he and Rosenzweig worked on the manuscript. This is Genesis, the beginning of the Hebrew Bible. And I think that brings us very closely already to the topic of our evening conversation between my friends who will shortly share their ideas with us. This is the original manuscript of Buber's I and Thou, which is, I would say, also in his own intentions, a very special manuscript, because it's not written on single sheets. It's written in a bound volume, which was clearly prepared to include an important manuscript, because he intentionally left spaces for empty sheets in order to add comments, to change maybe paragraphs, or even to glue new sheets, as you can see on this left side. So Martin Buber's papers have been recently scanned and digitized, and we are trying to upload them and also to enable our users to use them freely as much as possible, because there are still copyright issues with that. But this is, of course, the future, and both this manuscript and the idea of digitizing it, I think this is brilliantly matching to the continuation of this evening. And I'd like to turn over to Kinney and to Rabbi Wolpe. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction from a really remarkable institution that I know all of you benefit from, even if you have not yet had the opportunity to go and see the library, which I hope you will very soon. Kinney and I have spoken about this before, and I am charged with the 2-minute introduction to I and Thou. Please understand that obviously any philosophy to be explained as quickly as I'm going to explain Buber, you're doing a certain amount of violence to the subtlety and range of his thought, but we want to get to the essence of it so that we can talk about the applications to the modern world and to technology, and there will be lots and lots and lots to explore after we're done. Buber's essential insight is that all of human life is binary, is divided up into two different kinds of encounters. And it's true that it's very easy to divide things up into two. There was an American humorist who said that all people may be divided into two kinds, those who divide people into two kinds and those who don't. But nonetheless, Buber divided encounters into two different kinds. And when I tell you the first kind, it will be easy. The second is harder. The first is I-it. He said, you're never just an I. There's no such thing as an I in isolation, because you're always in encounter with other people, not only other people that are present, but even people who have passed away. You're in some kind of encounter with people who loved you who are no longer there, or people who love you who live in another place. They're always part of your orbit. And when you have an encounter with someone, he said, most of the time, your encounter is that of what we might call use. That is, this is not Buber's term. That is, you say to the waiter, can I have a glass of water? It's not that you aren't nice. It's not that you aren't polite, but you're essentially using the waiter as a vehicle to get you water. So it's even if you call someone in the middle of the night to cry on their shoulder, which seems like an act of close friendship, it's still an I-it relationship, because what you want from them is something that they can give you. Most of human life is that way. The other way to think about I-it is it doesn't require all of you. There's always, when we talk to one another, there's always like a line of type at the bottom of the screen about what we're really thinking while we're talking. So as I'm speaking to you now, I'm thinking, is this clear? Should I say it that way? Will Kinney grab this, hold of this point, that point? In other words, we are split selves most of the time. So we understand the I-it. The question is, what is I-thou? For Buber, in one sense, you can't completely define it. Because if you define it, then I'm sitting here thinking, oh, maybe I'm having an I-thou relationship. And if I do, then I have ended it, because I've made it an object of contemplation, of fascination, of analysis, which means I've separated myself from the encounter. But everybody can think of moments in their lives when you have been fully present, when you wanted nothing of the other person but the other person. You didn't want, there was no hidden agenda, there was no secret agenda. Now, maybe it was just a minute on a bus where you looked at someone and they looked at you, and you had an understanding that transcends language and words at that moment. Sometimes it's longer. For most relationships, it goes in and out. That is, like if you are married or you have a child, there you'll have moments of I-thou, and then you'll also have moments of I-it. The way Buber put it, and if you don't like gendered language, please remember this is 1923 and in Germany. He said, man cannot live without it, but he who lives with it alone is not a man. In other words, if you don't have the capacity to have that kind of instant and total encounter, you're not a full human being. The other point I want to make, and as I said, I'm abbreviating very much, but for Buber, who is a theologian after all, Buber is not a political analyst and he's not a sociologist, a theologian. I and thou always implies he or she or God, right? Every transcendent encounter implies transcendence. And so when you have that moment of I-thou, there is the energy of eternity around it. It's not just about the instant. And just to give one example of how Buber lived this, because he did live it. He was, as you can hear, if you're Jewishly literate, this is not a halachic rationale. In fact, Buber and Rosenzweig had a lot of debates about halakha, about Jewish law, because for Buber, for God to be a commander makes God into an it instead of a thou. But after the war, he was offered a prize in Germany, and they told him not to go because these were the murderers. But Buber believed in dialogue. And so he went back to Germany because he thought even with the enemy, even with the murderer, you have to have dialogue or everything collapses. How well we are doing with that and how we can do better is the province of my colleague. And she also is going to talk about how Buber got there in his life. Kinney?
Thanks, David. So in preparing for this conversation, I learned a little more about Buber the man, and specifically Buber the boy. And I learned that when Buber was 3 years old, his mother abandoned the family. She ran off with a Russian soldier. And in fact, Buber saw her. She was crossing the courtyard in front of their house, and he tried and failed to draw her attention and ask her to come back. So he experienced that real loss. I find it kind of astonishing that the man who has given the world one of the most provocative or interesting theories on relationships was in fact missing his own primary relationship. And then, as Stefan said, he went to live with his grandparents. And next door, there was an older girl living there. And one day, about maybe a year later, 2 years later, I don't think he was more than 5, he said to this neighbor girl, "I really hope my mother's going to come back." And she turned to him and said, "Your mother is never coming back." And according to Paul Mendes Flores's biography, he says it was at that moment that little Buber took away not only, this profound sense of loss and disappointment, but he germinated this nascent concept of the mismeeting, like MIS-meeting, this encounter between two people that could fall so short of its potential. So I think at the heart of I Thou is this idea that in every encounter, you can either heal or you can wound. And which one are you going to do? So David, let me ask you, so if Martin Buber stands for relationships and kind of putting that in the center and working on that experience, what do you think is the state of relationships today? How are we doing as a country or a world with our relationships?
I actually, the conventional answer to this is, oh, we're doing very badly. But I think it's uneven. I actually think in some ways we're doing better than we have in the past because we have more immediate encounter of people who are unlike us. And that's really important. And that's possible not only because of travel, right? I was just on a trip in Africa. Absent planes, I never would have met the people that I met, never would have seen them, never would have known anything about their lives. The same is true, obviously, of the internet. I think the pandemic, as awful as it was, and as much as we complained about Zoom, it enabled us to have encounters with people that otherwise we would not have. At the same time, we're doing very badly, in part because a lot of screens have replaced in-person encounters, and because we have, I think, lost to some extent the ability to see a person instead of a category. We, to a great extent, see one another as this kind of person, that kind of person, politically, nationally, as opposed to another human being. And Buber, in this sense, was adamant about encountering the person and believing that every person had a world inside of them. And so these typologies are bound to collapse if you actually take the time to be open to the I Thou. And the one other thing I should say is the I Thou in some sense is not a project. You can't say, I'm going to go out this morning and have me an I Thou experience. What you can do is create the conditions and be open to it. And then sometimes it will happen and sometimes it won't, but you can certainly prevent yourself from having an I Thou experience. And what I want to turn back and ask you, Kinney, is to what extent is this model of encounter in any way instantiated in social media, in the way that the companies that you've worked for have created the atmosphere in which, the sea in which we all swim, that is the way our screens work and the way our interactions work online?
Right. So I think it's what you said, which is that the record is mixed. I think, so for example, you could make the case that companies like Facebook and Google started out with a real I-thou ethos, right? Facebook was about connecting your connections and connecting those connections to other connections. It was like a whole, Buberian playground of relationships. And Google, the same thing, because through its search results, it changed that what truth was. So truth wasn't just what a few people said it was what most people found most reliable. So it was a very democratizing thing, and it depended on the relationships between people. But what happened is that companies like that took a hard turn and toward I-it. And you could say all business is I-it, of course, it's transactional. And so, no company is going to be purely I-thou, but they took a very hard turn toward I-it. I would say it's like I-it on steroids. And the reason is because it's what a former colleague of mine at Microsoft used to say. The business model they chose is advertising, and advertising is the bastard offspring of Silicon Valley's two incompatible foundational religions. So on the one hand, they believed in socialism, which is to say all software shall be free. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, capitalism, which is to say all lone geniuses in their garages shall be billionaires. And the only way for both of those things to be true was for companies to use advertisers as their business model. And so then everything changed, and those companies began extracting our data and anonymizing our data and monetizing our data, usually without our knowledge. And it doesn't get much more I-it than that.
The other piece of this that I think is increasingly, one of the things that we didn't say, although we alluded to it, is the degree to which, studies show that depression is increased, loneliness is increased, all the things that I-thou, in a sense, is here to cure us of, although it's a spiritual and not a purely psychological phenomenon. But especially on, let's say, Instagram, which is one of the whipping boys of people who have spiritual interests, the objectification, the non-encountering of another human being, the creation of an artificial self and the display of that artificial self is almost the if you could think of it like a complete antithesis to what it is that Buber thinks is most valuable in human life. I could hold up a 13-year-old on Instagram and say, this is exactly what he thinks is the antithesis of what matters in human life.
Right. It's almost like we're doing it to ourselves. We're doing I-it to ourselves. Yes. We don't, in putting up in a very intentional and artificial way, our image, our brand, our persona online to be consumed, right? We've like slid several degrees down in terms of, even the I-it that other people can do to us.
I wonder, before we get to things that technology could do, I wonder if some of the problem is what we also said was a good part of social media, which is you can't expand your circle too big and still have it filled with genuine encounters. We're not built that way. We're actually built on a much smaller scale. Like you can have a group of 10 or 20 or 30 people with whom you have real deep, 150, 500, 1,000, 10,000. What does it mean to interact in any meaningful sense with such a large number of people? It almost thins out by its very nature the kind of interactions that you have.
I don't know what the number is. It would be interesting to know the actual number, like the threshold beyond which your relationships get superficial. But I think that's right. And I think that Facebook has challenged us to stretch that number as far as we can. And it has, and certainly the rest of the social media platforms. And I think it's diluted quality of our friendships.
So what is it that you think social media could do? How could it change in theory? Because one of the things that you were alluding to is that the product is us, right? That's when Jared Leiner's point is that what they're selling is you. They're selling your information, your attention, your so on and so forth. So in some sense, the focus is on the person, but in a way that is distorted. And I wonder if you now were creating a social media company from scratch, you had a magic wand, what would you do? What would you make different?
So I think there are two areas of focus if we really wanted to turn this around. And I don't want to suggest that either one is easy or that they can be done short of having a magic wand. But I think the main two areas are design and personnel. So design, there are Buberian features in tech right now. Like we wrote about in our article, the 3 winking dots in text or in chat, right? Those are fantastic. It's like you send someone a message and then you get these 3 dots and they're saying like, I see you. I know you wrote me a message. I am writing back to you. Don't worry. You are not invisible. Don't panic that I'm ignoring you. Okay, so very Buberian kind of feature. And there are others, like, for example, we're on Zoom now, but Microsoft's version of that, which is called Teams, has an option where you don't sit together in these flat boxes, but you actually appear in the same room. So at the feature level, there are things we could do. And there's regulatory measures that we could and should take, like we can make algorithms more transparent. There's an example in Taiwan. The digital minister of Taiwan has removed the reply buttons from certain sites so that people can respond. They can say what they think, yes or no, but they can't reply. So they can't troll people in really nasty ways. So there are features that social media companies and tech companies generally and governments could impose on our dialogue, on our conversation, and it would take some of the nastiness out of human relationships or the exaggerated nastiness that goes on the web. And so there are things like that we could do. But I think even the more important innovation or the thing we need to correct is about the personnel, is about the people who work in technology companies and who run these companies and who invest in them. So technology is not this inexorable force that just happens to us. It is the result of decisions that are made by people who work in these companies and run them and invest in them. So Jaron Lanier, who you just mentioned, was a colleague of mine at Microsoft. And he has described for me something so fascinating. So let me just try to share this with you. Sure. He's known as the father of virtual reality, okay? And he thinks that the perception of reality exists on a spectrum of types of brains. And the fulcrum of sort of the thing that determines where you are on that axis is your perception of relationships. Okay, so on the one side of this axis, brains filter people out. Okay, so all you're left with is algorithms, no empathy, and the extreme version of that is autism. On the other side of the spectrum, the only thing that's filtered in is people. And so it's all about how you're perceived and who you perceive. And the extreme version of that is heightened social anxiety and heightened social manipulation. Now, some people say there's a gender component to this, that the first kind of brain is more male, the second kind of brain is more female. I wouldn't go there. And even Jaron points out that if you describe it that way, you have to concede that Donald Trump has an extremely female brain. Okay, like a brain that cannot see the world except in terms of how he's regarded, whether he's treated well or treated badly. Okay, so the point is, today in the tech workforce, the majority of people skew toward that first side of the spectrum. So relationships are not in the mental perception of reality for a good portion of the tech workforce. And until we fix that problem, I don't think we're ever going to have relationships in the center of our experience or in the center of technology. So it's a big issue, but it ought to be the one that people are focused on.
I mean, first of all, it's a fascinating way of describing it. And I also, it seems to me that you can, by the way, I think, describe philosophies that way too. The more analytic, the more mathematical, the more I don't remember which side it was, left or right. And the others, which are the more humanistic, the more Buberian, are to the other side. And if you ask yourself, by the way, this is the work, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Ian McGilchrist, who wrote The Master and His Emissary. He does a lot of work on the two sides of the brain and the way in which they interact and don't interact. And he essentially says about society in general, what you're saying about technology in particular, which is that we have, for a whole variety of reasons, increasingly in society, favored the detached, the analytical, the algorithm over this side of the interactive, human, synthetic, as opposed to, remember, the analytical brain breaks things into pieces in order for it to see how it works. The synthetic brain gets a gestalt of what the larger picture is. And that means in some ways that it is the inexpressible. And that's part of what Buber is saying about I thou, is I can't actually tell you what it is, because as soon as I tell you what it is, I'm appealing to the part of you that wants to break things apart and analyze them. It's what the playwright Ionesco said: everything is expressible in words except the living truth, right? There are certain things we know, like I know, there are certain things I know now that I'm older that I didn't know when I was younger, but the deepest things that I know, I'm not sure that I can tell you, even though I know that they're real. And there's also a bias in social media for explicability, to be able to tell people what things are, and there's a certain mystery to the Buberian world that doesn't fit well with people who, by their very nature, are explainers.
Well, what I love about what you're saying is if the binary is sort of analytic versus synthetic, breaking things down versus putting them back together,
right,
then you can totally understand why Buber thought that an I-thou relationship manifested the divine, right? Because that is unity, that is oneness, it is wholeness, it is putting things back together or never having broken them or something. And I think that is what is so interesting about his idea and why it's so hard to implement in the modern world. It's not easy to make a political platform, although I'm about to try, but it's not easy to make a political platform out of a Buberian world vision. But you can see why it feels like we ought to get there.
Well, there are a couple of questions in the chat that are tying into this, and one person asked about user-centered design. You want to say something about that?
Sure. I mean, look, tech companies are falling all over themselves to try to create designs that users will love. So sure, any good company ought to pay attention to its consumer. User is a hilarious word, by the way. Only tech companies use it, and drug users, right? I mean, it's like, so customers, consumers of tech companies ought to be the center of design thinking, right? So that's good. But even user-centered, right? I guess what I'm positing, or sort of where we're imagining, what we're imagining in this conversation, is that it isn't just the user, it's the pair of users, or it's the space between people talking to each other, right? It's not me sitting alone using a tech product. It's what does it do to the relationship I have with anybody else also in the ecosystem. So even to me, user-centered design is like the bare minimum, but it's not Buberian, right? It's not making the relationship the client. It's still making the individual the client. And I think Buber was striving for something better.
Right. I mean, part of this is the idea of returning people to each other. In some sense, as long as the social media platform is the platform that we both engage in together, then the third presence isn't God, the third presence is the platform. And a really Buberian platform would be in a deep sense transparent, because it would allow two people. One of the things, for example, I don't like about Zoom, and I don't know the fix to it, but I have to look at the camera in order to be looking at you. And if I actually look at you, then you can tell that I'm not looking at the camera, I'm not looking straight. So you can't look in each other's eyes when you speak, because you have to look in the camera to look in someone's eyes, and then you're not looking in their eyes. And so it can't be, it's not a transparent encounter for a lot of reasons, also because you're a little box on a screen, but also because you can't look at each other. And that seems to me like the minimum of encounter is to be able to look the other person, especially in the eyes. And this also raises larger questions of not only technology, but one of the questions on the chat was how we maximize this in education in general. And here, I think we have to also make a certain concession to the qualities of the individual. That is, some people are both more open to and more able to encounter than others. And it's, and there's a huge range. Some teachers connect better, some students connect better, some people connect better than others. And the most that a technology company can do probably is to give people space for the range of their natural gifts in that.
Well, that's a fascinating idea, though it's true now that, like, if we centered relationships, sure, some people would be advantaged, let's say, or some that would come more naturally to some. But we're centering other things now. You know, we're focused either on the individual user and just sort of what individuals need without regard for relationship, or we're focused in some vague way on what the masses need, the undifferentiated needs, which also doesn't take into account, you know, people's particular capacity to connect. But I guess what I'm interested in is, or what I would love to envision is some way that Buber's vision would come first, meaning the people who are good at relationships and who are good at connection, they would actually be the leaders of our society. Like, that's the thing we would prize. We recognize that not everybody has that innate ability, but we say we actually think that's important, and it will make for a better, you know, better businesses, better institutions, better teachers, better political leaders. And so that would be the thing that in my wand waving society, I would put that first.
So let's unpack that a little bit, because you and I have actually discussed this. You come into the doctor's office, and what question would a Buberian doctor ask you that your doctor doesn't ask you?
Right, exactly. Okay, so doctors have begun moving off of just, you know, cholesterol and blood pressure, and they've started to do sort of some public health questions, especially for kids. Like, they'll say, is there a gun in your house, or do you wear your seatbelt, right? But they don't yet ask, how many friends do you have? Who do you talk to when you're sad, right? They don't actually acknowledge the connection between a person's ability to connect and sort of the ecosystem of relationships that surrounds them and their flourishing, right? Their health. They don't yet make that connection. And so in a Buberian world, we'd do more of that.
So how do you see that? For example, we talk a lot in the American Jewish community about the troubled connection that many American Jews have with Israel. Can you speak about, is it possible to speak about this kind of individual connection, this one-on-one connection, with larger agendas like political or social or national or Jewish agendas in a way that would be helpful?
Well, one thing that's fascinating, one thing I noticed since I started putting Buber in the center of my own, my own filter of reality, is that AIPAC calls its client the American-Israel relationship. Like it uses that word over and over. Like that's the client, that's the center of its mission. And I think that's really smart. Like whether you're an AIPAC fan or not, it's just like to focus on the relationship, not on America's interests specifically or Israel's interests specifically, but on the strengthening of the relationship. I think that's given them a lot of mileage. So I'm not sure that totally answers your question, but that's the thing that popped into
Well, one of the I think going back to something that we were talking about before, the paucity of direct encounter between American Jews and Israel, the waning of the number of people who go to Israel, for example. And also, by the way, conversely, now the increasing encounter between Israel and the countries in the Abraham Accords.
Yeah.
That is the opportunity to actually see one another. I remember, let me just, a small anecdote. So I was going to Dubai for, of all things, the World Chess Championship. When Magnus Carlsen was playing, I really wanted to see him play. I thought this might be my only chance. And I asked the local consul general here, do you think it'll be okay? Like, what's going to happen if I wear my kippah in Dubai and Abu Dhabi? I had no idea. And he said, well, some of the Israelis might be uncomfortable. Which was a very funny answer. And the truth is that it did open opportunities, as it has many, many places in the world, to have genuine encounters. And I would have been transparent without it. And so that chance for Israelis and Americans and Israelis and American Jews and people in the Arab nation to actually have these face-to-face encounters, it's exactly the kind of thing that Buber was trying to do by going back to Germany in a very different time with a very different ethos. And that is, here I am, I'm actually a human being. I wake up as a human being before I become a Jew, a Muslim, an American, an Israeli. The first thing I am is a human being. And all human beings have this capacity for encounter without being utopian, which was one of the charges that was leveled against Buber. This was a very utopian idea that people don't really, they don't just embrace and encounter. They also fight and argue and so on. But putting this in the forefront of your consciousness, I think, is actually an opportunity to try and counter first.
I think that's right. I think that, look, you can dismiss the whole thing as utopian, right? And then that becomes like an avenue we don't need to go down because everybody knows utopias don't happen. But I think that there's a really important nugget of truth in what he's saying. Like, we are people first. And if we have any chance of getting to know anyone who might currently hate us, then we can try at least testing the limits of encounter, right? We can't assume that they will carry us the whole way and that they will never put us in danger, but we can challenge ourselves to test those limits and see if it can take us farther than we currently
do. There are some very wonderful and interesting questions on the chat. The very last one just came up about Buber's wanting to have an encounter with the Arabs in 1921. Look, Buber was an early proponent of a binational state. So he really believed that encounter was deeply, was even politically viable. Although we should also say that Buber wrote a very famous letter to Gandhi, who Gandhi basically advocated non-resistance against the Germans. And Buber essentially said, the Germans are not the British. He said it much more eloquently than that. But he was not so much of a utopian that he imagined for a second that non-resistance to the Germans was a viable alternative. And all of these things always inevitably have qualifiers. There is no principle that can carry only by itself. But I think what both Kinney and I are saying is, if you start to center this, you do begin to see the world differently, and certainly social media differently, and even the way people react to the pandemic differently, because the pandemic, by its very nature, is something that separates human beings from one another, and some people tried harder than others to find their way back. That is, there's also, we didn't talk about this, but there's also a safety in isolation and a danger in I thou. That is important. I remember when I was a teenager, people used to say that adolescents get on the phone a lot because it allows intimacy without danger. And I think texting does that even more. And we have to return to the danger of actual human encounter.
So let me switch gears for a second. I want to ask you a more personal question in the Buberian spirit. So they say that the great speech makers don't give speeches to 1,000 people, to a room full of 1,000 people.
Right.
They give 1,000 speeches one-on-one to each person sitting in the room full of 1,000 people. You are a renowned and terrific public speaker. Do you do that? Like, do you have a Buberian connection with each person in a huge auditorium or a huge congregation that you're addressing?
It's a curious thing. I don't know how other speakers do this. I find it hard when I speak to actually look at any individual, because I have a sort of individual construct in my head of the person that I'm talking to, who is often me. By the way, not exactly me, but your best speeches are always given to yourself. It's not like you do all the things that you're telling other people to do. It's because you're supposed to be paying attention. And so, yes, I remember reading once John Updike said when he wrote his novels, he had in his mind an old lady who lived a little east of Kansas. And he never met her, but like that's who he was addressing. And I have this sort of artificial construct in my head of the person that I'm talking to, and it shifts sometimes from speech to speech and measure to measure, but absolutely, I'm talking to one person in a larger, in a more convinced and didactic way than I would interpersonally, because I also know that people, even as they listen, are talking back to me. And sometimes they'll write me afterwards and say what they think, just as we're getting stuff in the chats. But yes, it's very hard to imagine communication with many people. But, and deep communication, it seems to me, is always directed towards the one. Remember that Moses, who is the exemplar of a human being in the Jewish tradition, at the end of his life, it doesn't say Moses was the most ethical man who ever lived. It doesn't say Moses did the most mitzvot of anyone who ever lived. What it says in ultimate praise of him is Moses saw God panim el panim, face to face. So that's the greatest thing we can do.
With that, I would love to turn to a couple questions. You've answered so many of them, both directly, Rabbi, you fielded some, and naturally your conversation went in a few directions, but we keep getting the same questions asked in multiple ways.
Okay.
For you to think about, and that is, if you were to adopt, or we all were to adopt a Buberian approach and using technology, what would be, in this day and age, what would be sort of your bottom line recommendation for us in terms of going forth in this digital age? I don't know where to look, if I should look at the camera or look at
I would start the first thing I would say, and then I'll turn it over to Kinney, but I feel this so deeply and I try to practice this, is to remember that behind every text, every tweet, every post is a person. And if you can react to that the way you would react if the person were in front of you, you will be much kinder and very different than if you react to it as though this is a disembodied text or tweet.
And I would go even farther. I love that point. And I would take it even farther, which is to say, even when we are face to face, we don't really think very often about really the story behind that person. You run into someone at work and you're not really thinking, like, are they having trouble with their kids at home?
Right.
Or are they, right? You're not, so I would say not only think about the person behind the screen, but think about the story behind the person. Because, and if we did more of that, I think we would be kinder. And I think we would be, less insecure ourselves. We'd be focused on the troubles other people are having, and it would be calming.
One of the questions was whether or not we should focus more on thou, I. I think this is sort of what you're getting at a little bit, Kinney, in your comment, rather than I, thou, but thou, I relationships. And would that help the conversation? And I'm wondering if Buber, why the I, thou, as opposed to thou, I? It's the
I think Buber was trying to tell you, since you're always with you, how you should move through the world. And if you the only thing ultimately you can change is yourself, right? You can't change someone else, but you can change yourself. So if you shift yourself and your orientation, those things will happen. But you can't, first of all, it's inhuman to always prioritize other people. But you can, I think if you change the way you relate, then every relationship changes. It's the one variable that actually changes your life.
And I guess I would just add to that what I love, maybe the reason you don't put thou first is because I think in the theory of I, thou, God doesn't come first. Like it's people encountering each other a certain way, and that is the experience of God. So it's not like, so it's like we have to take the action to then experience that, not that that presence is there just waiting for us to react. I don't know. Maybe I didn't mean to, like, I'm over the line in terms
of. I know,
of,
it's not, also, I think you have to discover, the I goes forth to discover the thou. You don't know what the thou is going to be. So you can't put it first. You have to discover it. And you have to be open to it. So this is very much about not having a project in your head, but having a willingness in your heart. And with that, I think you can discover things that are remarkable. I gave a sermon a couple of weeks ago, having come back from Africa, about all the people I met and how they reacted to me in different ways, and how I obviously reacted to them. But part of it was that I kept thinking, I'm just going to see like what I can discover, because this is such a rich world about which I know so little. And I think that is in some ways true of everyone in every world. We think we know, but we don't really know. Even people we know very well, have the capacity to surprise us, because if we're in the image of God, we're all infinite inside.
Wonderful. We have one last question. We had so many great ones. I want to bring up this one because it kind of brings the discussion into the political realm a little bit. And it's a question from our good friend, Josh Sukoff, who was thinking about what Martin Buber would have said about the Abraham Accords. What, bringing two peoples together on a human level, cultural exchanges. What would Buber be saying now about the possibilities ahead as a result?
You want to take it? Okay.
Well, I think you alluded to it earlier. I mean, I think that any agreement that opens up the possibility for human beings who didn't know each other before to know each other better, and to see what not, less what divides them and more what unites them, that seems like something Buber would smile about.
Yeah, every chance for increased encounters in this world is a chance for, look, let me actually, so I'll close with this. Our school had a campaign where everybody could put up either their name or they could put up a quote if you gave a certain donation on the wall. So our family chose to put up a quote as opposed to our name. And the quote we chose was from Buber, which is, "Every journey has destinations of which the traveler is unaware." And that's what it's about. It's like, if you if you embark on a new journey. So you're going to end up places that you could not have imagined before you started. By the way, just to close, that's true of conversations too. This conversation, Kinney and I spoke about it before, but this conversation went all sorts of places we didn't speak about because it was real.
That's amazing. And I will conclude by saying that this entire NLI USA Signature Speaker Series evolved during the pandemic when we were not speaking with one another, and brought, you know, brings hundreds and hundreds of people from 22 countries around the world, you know, joined together, people that would have never been on one platform. And here we are dealing with a different kind of I, thou, I relationship. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Stefan, thank you for sharing the library's Buber collections, the history of how they came to the library. This is just a tiny bit of what the library offers all of us. And we are completely committed to making those treasures come to life, to connect them to our everyday being, and to making them available to all of you digitally, virtually, and of course in person when the library opens next year, and you all will be visiting and enjoying the library, hopefully in person. And with that, we wish you a very, very happy new year, a healthy year, and a year of learning and great books. Shana tova, everybody.
Thank you.